Okay, welcome everyone to the Fire Guys podcast. Today we're lucky enough to spend some time talking to Liz McConaghy who was previously in the RAF, and some of you, or a lot of you, have read her book, The Chinook Crew Chick. I have a great difficulty saying that. I've had to practice
Everyone
that one.
does.
Yeah. Thanks, Liz, for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you're really busy, so I really appreciate it. So first, we'll go. So where were you born? Because your accent is different to mine.
It is, yeah. No, I was born in County Down, Northern Ireland, so that's where I grew up. In a town called Newtonards, but I lived in the country. I was a proper country bumpkin, as they call them. And then as I came across to England to join on my 19th birthday, so it was like a proper bunny in the headlamp, going, this is
Yes.
England then. So yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's funny that you say that. So I was about to ask you because um, I know what it's like. You know, when you leave home and you join the armed forces. So what was it like your first day? Shock and awe?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think so I didn't have any military background. I wasn't a cadet. We had a really good cadets group at school, but I never joined the cadets. I played hockey instead. And then the very fact that I got through all my kind of like, medical and all the interviews and the assessments to get into the military, I think I was still living in shock and awe at that point. Um, and I mean, there's a story in the book about my mum packing me off the 48 wooden coat hangers because it said in the joining instructions that you had to have wooden coat hangers. And she, being an Irish mum, thought, well, you maybe can't get those in England. So she sent me off with literally like two pairs of jeans, three tops, and 48 wooden coat hangers. So I really was the most underprepared young girl in the world. But I think that element of excitement and not knowing what was coming was actually what got me through basic training, just
Mm.
that like kind of, kid-like kind of lust for life and effervescence, I think got me through a lot of it. So I think sometimes in life, if we knew what's coming and we knew how tough things are going to be, we probably would never have signed up in the first place.
Yeah, that's for sure. So when you were in basic, how long was your basic training in the RAF?
So it was 3 months, and that was the 3 months of sort of carrying the pine poles around, building tripods with them, learning all the rank structures, which in the RAF, of all three forces, the rank structures in the RAF are the hardest ones to learn because they're just lines on people's shoulders. So
Yeah.
incredibly difficult. I think I was still saluting corporals on the main gate for at least the first month. Um, but yeah, 3 months of just that basic training. And a lot of the stuff that we would do is aircrew basic training, unlike very basic recruit training, is we do a lot of leadership in there. So there's two big exercises, sort of a practice one, and then your final X at the end. And that is to see if you can lead people, because we pass out of our basic training as sergeants. And sergeant is a big, heavy rank to carry on your shoulder when you've been in the military for 3 months and you're only 19 years old. So that's what they're kind of looking at. It's whether or not you can command people and you can lead people. It's slightly different to officer training, but it's more just about that leadership and teamwork.
So, right, okay. So you joined the RAF from being a civilian, and your trade was as aircrew? Is that how it
Yeah.
works?
Yeah. And whenever I went through, I was chatting to my mum today, and that was nearly 25 years ago. You could join already into that aircrew kind of joining group. You could already be either a loadmaster, as it was back in the day, which was the people that went on the back of helicopters, the back of the fixed wing aircraft, or AOP. And AOPs were the geeks, as I call them, that used to fly in the
Mm.
Nimrods and do all the maritime stuff up in Scotland. And I didn't want to go to Scotland and didn't really think I was clever enough to be an AOP. So I just always wanted to go loadmaster, which was essentially crewman. And within that, then I always wanted to go helicopters because maybe more for me, but I kind of really loved the idea of being in like an oil hydraulic, sexy helicopter over flying around and staying in hotels for the rest of my career. And looking back now, maybe that would have been a nicer option. Who knows?
So, so you passed basic training, you passed your trade training, and that was 3 months. So then what happens?
So then after the 3 months there, we stayed at Cranwell for a little bit longer and did like a ground school. And that was learning a lot of things about rules of the air, how to load some stuff into the back of a mock-up kind of cabin of an airframe. And it was very generic, you know, just things like weight and balance and all that kind of stuff. A lot of like sort of, again, the rules when you're dealing with a lot of that freight. So stuff that civilian companies would deal with, you know, like dangerous goods and, you know, customs documents and things, like really not very exciting stuff. So stayed there for about 3 months doing that. And then I was lucky that I got my dream and got sent rotary. So I went up to a place in Shropshire called RAF Shawbury. And that's when I started my basic helicopter training. And that was on a tiny little helicopter called the Griffin, which was basically a Huey, like an old style Huey. The Vietnam kind of war films. And that's when we then came together with a bunch of pilots and we were on a course together and we'd learn all that teamwork. And I guess the important point now is to tell, you know, a crewman's job, for anyone who's watching who doesn't know what a crewman does, we're the eyes and ears of the pilots. So the pilots are essentially the taxi drivers. They get us around the skies from A to B. And then when we get to wherever we are, we have to make sure that the tail is clear, the tail rotor is clear going into a landing site. We have to make sure that we are overhead and underswing load when we're picking one of those up. And we basically talk the aircraft onto the ground and around the sky. So that's the kind of bread and butter stuff. And then we do a lot of the radios, a lot of the navigation. Obviously, when you then ramp up onto a frontline aircraft, you do the weapons and you handle all the weapons and all of the freight that comes inside. So it's really diverse, a very diverse job.
Yeah.
I finished there and then went off to the front line. So went down to RAF Odium, which is where the Chinooks are still based, the home of the Chinook Force today. And that's when I guess I started like the real kind of, I guess, the cool bit of kind of all the basic training and started to, like, when dreams started to come true.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've read that you were one of the first female crews on the Chinooks. Is that correct? Is that right?
Yeah, so there was a couple of females who went before me, but they sort of came and went very quickly on the force. They didn't stay for very long. And by the time I got there, I was the only one. So they had been and gone. So there was kind of no one really around to kind of ask for advice, really. It was just me. And I was the only one for 4 years. And then there was a couple came behind me. And I think in the heyday, we had 6 female crewmen. So we were always in the minority. But I have to say, we were never singled out to be like the weaker sex or a minority in any way by the lads. We were just part of the gang, really. And I think that's because we're always very authentic. You know, I wasn't scared to ask for help when I needed it. I didn't try to be macho or start swilling beer and watching football or anything like that. I just stayed as my authentic self. And I think a lot of teams are built on trust, aren't they? And you can spot someone who's wearing a mask or lying very quickly in any small knit team. You know, for example, somebody says, "Oh, I love football," and someone goes, "Oh, who's your favorite player?" And you're like, "Eric Cantona," and everyone's like, "Maybe a little bit out of date there, Liz." So I always was authentic and my true self, and I think that that's where you really do build those bonds and you get your credibility, and I think that's sort of what stood me in good stead for most of my career.
Yeah, definitely. So you got to fire weapons as well?
Yeah, so we had 2 weapons fitted on the Chinook, an M60, which is the old, again, Vietnam War era. They used to bungee them off the side of the Hueys, and they fired 200 rounds in 2 minutes. So it's an airborne weapon, so it's a decent enough weapon, but it's not a huge rate of fire. And we had those fitted to the weapons in Iraq. And then for Afghanistan, we moved those to the ramp, and we only had those fitted on the ramp. But we got the minigun fitted to the front left and right hand doors. And the minigun fires 3,000 rounds a minute. So it's a huge amount of firepower. And I think for me as quite a young girl, I mean, I was in Iraq at 21. I was the youngest aircrew to go to Iraq. And then we moved into Afghan. I was only 23 when we hit Afghanistan. And, you know, I think for me, knowing that we were fitting those weapons, I thought, well, we're not fitting these huge weapons for no reason. So I kind of knew the threat was going to be ramping up a bit. And yeah, it did for sure. That's probably an understatement.
Yeah. Did you, before you went to Iraq and Afghanistan, did you have any other different types of role in the RAF, or it was just solely you moved to the Chinook Force and that was it?
Yeah, no, I was really lucky. I sort of stayed in the Chinook Force for my entire career until essentially my neck packed up in 2019 because it's not a kind aircraft on the body. But I was really lucky. And again, whenever I went through, there wasn't that much in terms of holding to kind of get through courses. So I kind of whizzed through my training pretty quickly. And again, I think that kind of lent into me being was so young when I went to the front, when I went to war for the first time.
Yeah.
Is, you know, I was only 21. I had, thankfully, before hitting Iraq, I had been down to the Falklands for a detachment, so down there. But again, the Falklands at the time when I went, which was 2002 or three, I know it was like a playground. It was just loads of bars, loads of drinking, lots of flying with a hangover. But it was good to kind of cut your teeth and like earn, like know your bread and butter and kind of learn how the aircraft worked as a tasking aircraft and what you could put in it and underneath it safely. So it was good to actually have that as a bit of like a sort of yeah, just a playground really before I went to war. But yeah, war was definitely next step up.
Okay. So can I go back to your training? Because it sounds like, I mean, it's completely different how I envisaged, to be honest. So what was the biggest challenge during your training in the RAF? Because you've got a lot to learn.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just military bearing to begin with. For a young girl, he's 19 years old and is from Northern Ireland with, again, no map background, just that kind of sense of occasion and military bearing and all those things is, you know, not mucking around when you're in uniform because you're 19 years old, you know, just that kind of trying to grow up really quickly. I
Yeah.
think we pretty much a big step up. But I think, you know, as we went through training, I mean, aircrew training, it's not easy by any stretch. I think, you know, what talking on the intercom is really difficult because you have to balance your radio so that four people who are all plugged in on the same intercom can talk and say their message clearly so it's heard at the right time.
Yeah.
So you've all got something to say and everyone says it at once, it just comes over the radio at the same time. And then if air traffic are saying something at the same time, no one can hear anything. So it's about understanding when to say a message, timing, knowing how to turn radios down. That was quite a big challenge really going through my helicopter training. And I think, if I'm being totally honest, the biggest challenge from, you know, getting through basic training to the front line in Afghanistan was probably the escape and evasion training that we did. So we do an escape and evasion course, resistance to interrogation.
Yeah.
And it's a week long down at St. Morgan, and it was brutal. You know, you go on the run for a week, you're in your flying kit and your flying boots, but you get nothing else. You know, you don't get a sleeping bag or any of those other, or a nice tent or anything. You're literally on the run as if you've been thrown out of a helicopter and you're running away from the enemy. And the whole week, the hunter force are trying to catch you. So you have to move at nighttime and you lay up in ditches and whatnot during the day. You don't eat for the week. So by the time the end of the week comes, you're pretty much low on energy. And then you get caught by the hunter force, you get bounced, as the term is, and you get taken in for interrogation. And then once you go into the interrogation house, again, there's lots of conditioning where they play babies crying to you, you get locked in a cage, there's white noise, a stress position, and then you have to do interrogation. So it's all trying to break you down mentally so you give away secret information. And it's, you know, your brain plays tricks on you and all sorts. You've seen, I'm sure you've seen things like this on the TV. I think Foxy's SAS Who Dares Wins kind of does it pretty good justice. But it was the deepest I've ever had to dig mentally to get through that course. And I think because I never really had a plan B, you know, the military was all I ever wanted to do since I was 19 years old. That's, I think, how I got through that course. I didn't have a, well, if I fail this, I can do that instead attitude. I just had I have to pass this, otherwise it's game over. So I think that's what got me through.
So it is a pass or fail then, the SEER training.
Yeah, and well, if you fail it, you get a second go at it. You have
Oh,
to
okay.
go through it again. And trust me, no one wants to have to do that.
No.
But if you don't pass it, then you don't go to Afghanistan. So it was a prerequisite for that theater. So yeah, it was definitely a big challenge, I have to
Yes.
say.
Yeah, I bet. And was the input, did you get much input how to resist interrogation and all of that during that course?
Yeah, you get a couple of days in the classroom beforehand, so you kind of
Yeah.
get taught about, and it had just switched over. The whole system had just switched whenever I went through mine, because before that it was all you could give out was your name, rank, and
That's
number. So
right. Yeah, I
literally, you
remember.
resist everything. That would have been back in your day. You
Yeah.
resist talking about anything. It then changed to, and I think it was all very much based around the enemy that we were facing, and they knew that just giving name, rank, and number is not going to really buy you any time with the Taliban. So they changed the system to become slow release of information. And that essentially meant that for the first couple of interrogations, it was name number that you gave out. And then when they started to get really fed up with you not giving them any information, you started to release some slow details about
Yeah.
where you swear what you were doing, but only open source information, for example, that you could Google, you know. So if they would ask you about self-defense kit and what the codes were, and you'd say, well, I don't really know how that works, but you know, this is how the jammer works, which is kind of open source anyway. So it was all a big game of knowing what you could and couldn't say. And then you'd have good cop and bad cop would come in, and somebody like, Liz, oh, you know, they've been so brutal on you, and that guy just spat on you. Would you like a nice warm cup of tea? And while you're drinking your tea, tell me this bit of information. So yeah, you have to stay really, really alert the whole time. But yeah, good fun, I guess.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, good fun.
Yeah,
So
learn a lot.
yeah, blimey. Well, I mean, there's a lot to be said by going through hard stuff, and you learn from mistakes as well, don't you? I'm sure there's stuff that you learned during that course that's helped you no end in you know, in the
Yeah,
recent
it
past.
has. And I think you're right. I think, you know, I'm quite, when you go through something as hard as that, then you do feel a little bit sort of, I certainly more prepared going to war.
Mm.
Um, because, and they weren't easy on me because I was a female, you know, I got exactly the same treatment as the lads. And I'm kind of glad that that was the case because, you know, the Taliban were never going to go easy on me if we'd have been
No,
caught.
no.
There's the old saying, train hard, fight easy. And that's absolutely what that course is about.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, without a doubt. So so you spent how many years in the RAF? 19? Was it
17 and a half. Yeah,
17?
so
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So a long time. Was there anything that you wanted to do in the RAF, but you just didn't get a chance to do, or just
I
didn't have the time to do?
I mean, I would only ever wanted to stay on Chinook Helicopters. They were literally the love of my life for most of my career. And I kind of moved up the promotion ladder within that. I became an instructor. I was a gunnery instructor. I kind of ticked all those boxes. And sadly, my neck packed in whenever I was kind of after we left Afghanistan for the last time. And I mean, I'd done 2 Iraq deployments, 10 Afghanistan deployments, and then, you know, it's not a kind aircraft on the body. I'd done over 3,000 flying hours, so my neck vertebrae just started to grind on top of one another and gave up. So I was grounded and then went through the medical discharge process to be released from the RAF. And I think I was just about on the cusp of getting my next promotion, and I would have become warrant officer. And there has never been a female warrant officer in the
Yeah.
Chinook Force. And I look back and think that's probably because we broke them all before they got there in terms of physicality, because
Yeah.
again, it's such a hard aircraft to fly on. But I give it a good stab. I got within clutching distance,
Yeah.
but yeah, and I didn't realize at the time, you know, leaving the end, it certainly took its toll on me because it was that lack of, you know, when you've given your whole life to something and you put that flying suit on every day, you know, it was my entire identity. It was being a Chinook crewman wasn't a job for me, it was who I was. And
Yes.
then suddenly, overnight, you're invisible, you know, you've taken the uniform off, you're out of the club, you know,
Yeah.
you want to go see all your mates in the club on the Monday, you've got to pull in, get a car pass, get escorted on the camp. It's such a hard stop at the end of a service life, and it's probably the very similar in the, you know, all the blue light services. You give your entire life to that service, and then the day you leave, it's like, yep, cheers, bye, and you're out of the club. And it can be really hard to then refine that identity. And you know, it took me a long time to realize that you define the uniform, not the other way around. I think so many of us think that that uniform defines us, and it doesn't. You breathe the life and the soul and the personality into the uniform. So it was quite an adjustment period, really, coming out the other side.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say, I mean, I spent 5 years in the Navy and nearly 30 years in the fire service. Hardest time was me when I left the Navy. And I'd only spent 5 years. So it
Yeah,
would, you know, God knows what it would have been like if I'd spent 17 and a half years like yourself.
yeah.
But for me, just recently left the fire service after nearly 30 years, I had a plan. So I was okay. But yeah, I think you're right. It's for when people leave the armed forces, it is a massive, massive shock to the system.
And it's funny that you chose to go into the fire service when you left the Navy, because I think a lot of us, you know, we don't join up for the money or the
No,
lifestyle. We
no.
join up because there's something inside us all that is the seed to serve. I mean, especially look at NHS nurses, you know, none of them do that for the lifestyle and money. They do it because they want to make a difference.
Yeah.
And that seed to serve and make a difference doesn't go away when you leave the forces.
No.
And I think that's where I really floundered, because I felt like I had no purpose when I left. You know, me getting up in the morning wasn't making a difference to anyone's day. And I think that's why so many people leave the forces and go, like, they seek out those other roles that are making a difference in the blue light kind of sector as well, or they go into charity work, or they start doing stupid marathons and endurance events,
Yeah,
raising
that's right. Yeah,
money.
yeah,
You always see veterans in those kind of positions, and I think it's because that they're still trying to get that purpose, that, you know, why am I getting up this morning? And yeah, you see it with so many of them when they leave.
yeah, yeah, definitely. We're coming, time's going very quick. Just looking at my clock. So for the second, I know we're okay for a bit longer. I apologize for this.
Right, another 5 minutes think on this one, and then we'll go into the
Yeah, so before we go into the second part, what advice have you got for people leaving the armed forces?
ooh. I think I already sort of covered a little bit. Is believe in it's you that defines that uniform. You know, believe in the skills that you have within you. The forces isn't everything. I thought it was,
Yeah.
and I hadn't really believed in the skill set that was within me. And my first CV looked like Liz, age 5.5, had written it. You know, it was like, I can't fly on a helicopter, I can't shoot a big gun. And I think, you know, just there's so many transferable skills that you will have that civilians
Definitely.
take for granted. And, you know, timekeeping, you know, sense of occasion, project management is something most people in the forces can do with their eyes shut, you know, just commanding a team and leading people, getting the job done, thinking outside the box. But we don't know how to put those on paper. So I think, you know, really invest some time in your CV if you are looking, if you're leaving and then going into a new role.
Yeah.
You know, even get someone who's been out before you to look at it and help you with it, because I didn't, and I think that wasn't a great idea. But believe in yourself, believe in your own ability, because the force isn't everything. It's probably a really good, you know, stepping stone into other things, but it's not your entire identity.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. But have a plan as well, I
Yeah.
guess. Have a plan. Have an A, B, and C plan of what you're going to do next.
Exactly. Exactly. And
Yeah,
use the network. I mean, I think the veterans, took me a long time to be able to say that I was a veteran with any pride. I just kept saying, oh, I used to be in the forces.
yeah,
I think the term veteran still had a load of stigma about, you know, being those
yeah,
bold guys down the British Legion, or the guys stood at the side of the cenotaph on Remembrance Sunday. And, you know, I was a veteran at 37. And I think just being able to use that word veteran with some element of pride rather than oh, I'm on the scrap heap now. And I think
yeah,
Veterans Network is the best network you can be part of, because you know, you can't buy into it. No one can buy into the Veterans
no,
Club. You've got to have done your service. But not only that, you now have the freedom, the shackles have been taken off, but you have all the good knowledge from your time in. So I think being a veteran is almost a cooler club than being in the still wearing uniform club. So, but you've got to embrace it. And I think the Veterans Network out there, you know, everyone's trying to help each other. And it really is, you know, really good. If you reach out, social media is fantastic for that. You know, if you reach out to a Veterans Network and ask for some help or advice or guidance, even coming back to the CV thing, people just want to help you. It
yeah,
really is a very positive and dynamic club. And just to, you know, see what other veterans have done with their life post-service is really inspiring. So I think don't be scared of becoming a veteran. You know, use that
no.
term and use it as a badge of honor.
And that's what we'll speak about in part two, about some of the things that's helped you.
Yeah.
So we'll have a bit of a break and then we'll come back and delve deeper.
So cool. See you in a minute.
Great.